The Western pro-life movement cares about protecting young mothers and their children from harm. But historically, that's also what the law is designed to do. Will those laws be restored? Yes, they will. And we will show you how. On this edition of Life Matters, our host Brian Johnston has been a teacher at every academic level. As is so often the case with teachers, he has also coached. Many on the California pro-life team call him the Life Coach. Today, you'll find out why on Life Matters. And now here's our host, Brian Johnston.
Welcome back to Life Matters. We're your program on the right to life and what it really is. Today's episode is a very special replay of a very important principle. If you want to understand what's really happening right now, you must understand your history. And there is an assault on your history right now. Understand why that assault is taking place. You know, a lot of people think we should be talking about babies in every program. A lot of people think we should be talking about pregnancy. And we've done that before. But you know something? If that's what you think the right to life is about, then you don't quite understand what's going on. You don't understand what happened on January 22nd, 1973 with the Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton decisions. You don't get any of that. Now, I really like babies. Don't get me wrong. And we've talked about them. There's entire programs. We've had medical specialists on that talk about the development of the child in the womb. It's inescapable. The science is there. We've had abortionists, former abortionists, that talk about what they've done with that child. But you're probably aware, I don't often talk about babies and mommies. I love them both. They should both be protected. But we talk about something much more enduring, and it really is one common topic. It is the right to life, which is a principle that emanates from natural law. And if you don't understand that principle, then you don't understand much. That sounds pretty bold, doesn't it? But that's what our founders said. And we've talked about that in the past, that self-evident truths, they're made known through the laws of nature and of nature's God, and that these are discernible. If you look into the laws of nature and principles of nature, you're able to discern that there is a higher law. A lot of people confuse natural law with the law of the jungle, the law of natural selection. No, those are two opposite principles. The law of natural selection says, I've got power and I can do whatever I want with it. Natural law says, no, you can't do whatever you want. You can't go out and kill someone because you have that ability. There is a higher law. And so even your friends who disagree with you, and again, listen to the dominant media, when they say there's an injustice, what they're really saying is that, well, here's a law, but that law violates a higher law. This reference to higher law, which everyone invokes, if you ever use the word injustice, you are stating there's a higher law. Today we're going to talk about that principle again in greater depth, but I'm going to remind you about something, and that is you and I have been mistaught history. That's right. We're going to talk about history because history impacts the present. And if you don't understand history, you will not understand the present. That may seem like a sweeping statement. When we come back, we're going to talk about it in detail and why it matters. You're going to understand why historical revisionism is going on right now in your culture. And you're being told, no, America has a different history. You have to learn the new history. You have to learn to hate the old history that you had learned. You have to know that you are evil because of your nation's history, and we must tear down that history. It must be removed. That's being told to you right now, to your friends and neighbors, and especially to your children. But I want to go one step further. It's not just happening right now. Historical revisionism and a misunderstanding of history. I'm going to spend time talking about the history of slavery and the history of what Abraham Lincoln did. It's been lied about. But even when you were taught this, and I was taught this, I've had to examine the real facts. We're going to talk about the facts of slavery, how slavery and abortion are in fact the same issue. Can you own another human being? And if you supposedly own another human being, can you kill that human being that you say you own? We have faced this issue before, but most Americans have misunderstood the history of slavery, the history of the United States. They've been given a revisionism. By the way, it's not your fault. I'm not blaming you personally. You could have gone to an excellent school. I went to some pretty good schools myself. I had some great teachers. But the problem is the ideology that infected education, the progressivism of John Dewey actually, impacted the American academy, the American view of education. And he brought a relativism, a progressivism with its view of history. And that's altered how we view history. And so we can't apply it right now, but it applies, and it applies strongly. Also in Europe, Dewey, his principles really took over academia at the beginning of the 1900s, late 1800s, 1900s. But in Europe, long before that, the same falsity about history was being taught, and it caught on like wildfire. And that is the view of Hegel regarding the flow of history and the purpose of history, that it's going somewhere, you have to leave the past behind. And that undergirds much of Marxism and all of progressive ideology. You got to leave the past behind. You have to look to the brave new world, and the government is going to fix that new world. So leave history behind. Understand that it needs to be thrashed and trashed, and you're not going to know what to do with the present if you don't fully understand the real significance, the real meaning of history. But it's critically important to realize we're dealing with the present right now. We'll be right back.
Life Matters continues after this.
Well, now we have a special opportunity for Life Matters listeners wherever you are. You can be on the air. That's right. If you have a question for Life Matters, we have a special way for you to ask that question. Tell us where you're listening from, speak slowly and clearly, and you can record a message. Go to lifematters.life. That's lifematters.life. Scroll to the bottom of the page, and there you'll see Send a Message to Brian Johnston. Using your computer's microphone, you can record a message, and it'll record clearly. You can't go longer than 90 seconds. But please feel free, if you have a question or a comment, make sure you keep it polite. We do have to edit, and we can't put impolite stuff on the air, but we do want to hear from you. That's lifematters.life. Scroll to the bottom of the page and give us your thoughts.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Welcome back to Life Matters. As you know, we're talking about the laws of nature and of nature's God. We're talking about history right now on Life Matters. We get deep into principles, but really how they apply to real life all around you. And if your principles are not applying to real life all around you, you're living in a world of theory. Some theories are very, very valuable. Other theories are very, very deadly. And if you can't make those distinctions in this battle of ideas, you've lost. You're in a battle of ideas. And if you don't know that right now, you've lost. So you have to work to get clarity as to what it is you understand and why you understand that. I'd mentioned when we left about history, that you have been taught a principle of history that's false. Probably because, not of your fault, it's probably because you were educated in an American school. But that's all right. If you were educated in a European school, you would have had the same problem. American school and American education has been influenced sweepingly, and even parochial schools, influenced by John Dewey's view of history, relativism, and progressivism. That is the undergirding principle in American education, and it's only gotten worse. European education anchored in Hegel's view of history, both of them very, very destructive. But I want to talk a little bit about a deeper understanding of history. This may blow your mind, but you need to know that history is cumulative and history is right now. History is not far away. Everything that's actually happened up until this moment has contributed to this moment. Now, that might sound like a Zen statement. That might sound like something that's entirely detached from how you view history, and it probably is, because history is old stuff. Long ago, that was then, this is now. And so we have to leave that behind. Wrong. I was very inspired by the Spielberg movie Amistad. And by the way, we're going to talk further about the slavery issue, but the Amistad was a Spanish slave ship that came ashore in New York in 1839. There was a slave revolt on the ship of the Mende tribesmen that had been sold into slavery by another African tribe. And of all people, it was John Quincy Adams. This really happened. John Quincy Adams had to go to court to defend their freedom, even though they were, in essence, they were fugitive slaves. We just didn't know who their owners were. But even in that time, America had the fugitive slave law. So John Quincy Adams had to go to court on behalf of these Mende tribesmen. It's a great film, a really great film. And one of the principals is a great actor, and you'll know him to see him. I want to pronounce his name right. It's Djimon Hounsou. And you'll know him when you see him, though. He was also the gentleman who played the African slave in Gladiator, who befriended Gladiator. So you know the character portrayed by Djimon Hounsou. And he says this when confronted with what we should do. And he was speaking for all of the Mende tribesmen. And he said a very powerful thing. He said, "My ancestors lived so that I might stand in this moment." You think about that. My ancestors lived so that I might stand in this moment. You're not here by accident. Your life is not an accident. And you aren't just some collection of cells. There is a purpose to life, and your life has purpose right now, and it is rooted and related to all that's gone before. This is a very important view of history, and you can find it. You can find it in others. So this is an incisive reflection of the reality that truly does surround us. We'll be right back after this.
You're listening to Life Matters.
We are individuals that lived all over the world as missionaries, but we have also become coffee aficionados. Our travels have introduced us to the most delicious and extraordinary coffees we've ever tasted. Now we import those same beans, roast them fresh at your request, and fly these savory coffees directly to you. Winged Spur Coffee. Try the best coffee you've ever tasted. Go to wingedspurcoffee.com.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Now I want to take a moment to remind you of the phrase historical revisionism, because historical revisionism is an attack on history. It literally seeks to redefine what happened. And again, if you followed Marxism, if you followed any progressive ideology, National Socialism, the Nazis, they intentionally burned old books, they banned books, they rewrote history, because they didn't want old things to be remembered. They were redefining all of society. And in order to do that, they had to remove the old history. But the fact is that historical revisionism is, simply put, lying. That's what it is. It's happening all around you right now, by the way. But I want to go a little bit further back. If you're my age, I'm not telling you what that is, but you have an idea. If you were educated anytime, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, in the 2000s, unless you had an extraordinary education, you were taught certain things about the issue of slavery, about the Civil War, about how we ended slavery, and about what the issues were at hand. And most of America has come to believe that. But most of it is actually false. I'm going to spend a little time right now because it's really important if you're going to understand Roe versus Wade. Because many people are taught that slavery was about the whole issue of federal law versus states' rights. And because the Civil War ended the way it did, it was one of the final blows to states' rights. But that isn't the correct history. In fact, there was the issue of states' rights. It was actually front and center. But Lincoln was not fighting against states' rights. Abraham Lincoln was fighting for the rights of free states to protect the lives of those within their borders. And that was being denied. You weren't told that. But that's the reality of the Civil War. It was about states' rights. But the South was breaking those states' rights obligations and expanding slavery into the free states. I'm going to describe that now. If you need to take notes, please do. I want you to know that the condemnation of states' rights by the Civil War was not what happened. It affirmed the rights of the free states. And because the free states continued and were able to continue, then those laws on slavery were also put into the federal law. But it did not dismiss states' rights, because states' rights are an essential principle of the United States of America, and most Americans don't know what that means. So let's talk about why Lincoln had to do what he had to do and what you have not been told by most American history classes. I want to remind you that Roe versus Wade, most of you know this, it struck down the existing laws of all the several states that were protecting babies. There were existing laws. And Roe versus Wade said, nope, you can't protect those babies. But it also did something regarding states' rights. The U.S. Constitution said that the federal government can't mess with states' rights because the federal government is designed to give states a voice in that government, and that is in the Senate. Up until 1913, every senator was actually elected not by people, but by state legislatures. Each state legislature sent their state's senator to the United States Senate. Right now, most people have a distorted view of what the Senate is. They don't understand its purpose. And they think, well, it's just my elected representatives. No, that is not. That is not how your Constitution worked. The House of Representatives are your elected representatives, and they speak for you. You can call them. You can ask them, please do thus. Please do so. Pass this bill. Stop that bill. But the other house of Congress is not merely just an older and fatter group of congressmen. A lot of people think that. No, the purpose of the Senate is to represent the interests of each of the several states. And it's really, according to the Constitution, it's the states that call up the senator. It's the state legislatures, if you will, that say, look, California needs this law. Your state needs this law. Please pass it on behalf of your state. That the purpose of the Senate is entirely different. It's nothing in kind with the House of Representatives. It represents other legal bodies, autonomous states. They would be autonomous except they're united. And it was the Senate that united the states and gave each of these several authority jurisdictions a voice in federal jurisdiction. It is the Senate that allows the states to be united. People don't realize that. Now, what happened in 1973, the Supreme Court overturned the laws of all 50 states, but they also assumed for themselves the authority of the Senate to make new laws on a federal level for the 50 states. So, two important words. First, they abrogated, that means they canceled out, the laws of each state, and then they arrogated the authority of the Senate. That means they assumed to themselves the authority the Constitution put in the Senate. The Senate is the one that's supposed to speak for the states on the federal level. So the Supreme Court made up a new federal law to govern all the states, but that's really the authority of the Senate if you read the Constitution. Now, that arrogation of power has created great problems. There's other confusions about the Senate. You're probably aware if you've ever read the Constitution. American voters don't elect your president. Never have and still don't. American voters don't do that. It is the states that elect the executive. So that's part of our Constitution. Each state has a voice in electing the chief executive, the president. And that is still the case through the Electoral College. And if you recall, this just happens to be a matter of present history, that's what was supposed to take place on January the 6th, and the president of the Senate, he was not acting as vice president. The president of the Senate happens to be vice president, but as president of the Senate, it's his job to confirm that each of the several states have followed the laws and procedures of their states in appointing the Electoral College. His job was to confirm that. That's written in the Constitution. That's how the Constitution works, because it's actually the states that elect your president. And that's why the Electoral College is there, if anybody asks you about that. Let me go back to the Civil War really quick, because it's so important. The issue of slavery, as you know, was lurking underneath the American psyche from its beginning. And most Americans didn't like it. But they also knew if they're going to break away from England, they can't go to war over slavery. They're going to have to come up with a compromise, and many of you are familiar with that compromise. But the goal of that compromise was to make sure that slavery was held back. Slavery was hated by most Americans. Even in some slave states, people like Robert E. Lee later, he didn't like slavery. A lot of people who lived in slave states didn't like the process. But what happened is that by this compromise, slavery was allowed in certain states, but also a limit was being put on it. And people like Abraham Lincoln were part of a party called the Whigs. And their goal was to make sure that we limit slavery. But guess what? Slavery was winning. The decisions of the United States were saying free states cannot protect slaves. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, that's what the Supreme Court said to those who wanted to protect babies. No, your state can't protect babies. And what was happening, and I'm going to give you a series of decisions. First is the Fugitive Slave Act. And it said if a slave runs away and ends up in a free state, you know what? You better go get that slave. You better extradite that slave back to slavery right now. And you cannot say that slave is free, even if you're a free state. So literally, if you remember the Underground Railroad, you weren't really free till you got to Canada because of the Fugitive Slave Act. But it gets worse. It gets much worse. Because in 1854, as America was expanding, the nemesis of Abraham Lincoln proposed a law, a new federal law that broke the agreement to limit slavery. And that was called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They were creating 2 new territories. And in order to create the territories, by the way, it wasn't just of those 2 states. We're talking about millions of square miles that would go to make up not just Kansas and Nebraska, but many of the states reaching out all the way to the Washington border. And so this was a real important issue because the Kansas-Nebraska Act said, hey, the Missouri Compromise is off. No deal. Any state that wants to be a slave state can be a slave state. And so there's no longer that guarantee of holding slavery in check. They were saying slavery can expand. And the Whigs' plan, Abraham Lincoln's plan, he was a Whig. He was actually the chairman of the Illinois Whig Party. Remember, the Whigs wanted to hold things in place, but they were failing. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act was devastating. That's really what started the Civil War, Bleeding Kansas. If you're familiar with what was happening, they were fighting to determine if they could be a slave state. And then, to add insult to injury, the Supreme Court said, we're going to fix it. We've decided the Supreme Court needs to step in, and they passed the Dred Scott decision. Many people don't realize what that decision was about. He was a slave that passed into a free state and then eventually was brought back to a slave state. He sued for his freedom because he had been in a free state. The Supreme Court, in its wisdom, said, no, hang on. If you're a slave, once a slave, always a slave. We're going along with slavery in free states. You get to a free state, too bad. We are proclaiming that slavery can be practiced in a free state. The Supreme Court said that. So what was happening is the states' rights of free states were being stripped away. That was the motive of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party, to have the right and have the ability to actually end slavery in a free state. They were told they could, but it was being denied them by the federal government. The rights of those states were being denied by the federal government at each of those legal turns. This is incredibly important because that's exactly what Roe v. Wade did. Roe v. Wade says, no, Supreme Court says abortion's going to be legal in Texas and in Georgia. Well, no, in fact, abortions are going to be legal in all of the states. Too bad, you guys. It's exactly the same principle. And the authority and the right of the state to do their job, you know what the right of the government is to do? Is to protect the lives of those in their jurisdiction. And the free states couldn't do it. And pro-life states couldn't do it because of what the Supreme Court did. The Supreme Court abrogated the ability for the states to make law, and the Supreme Court arrogated the authority of the Senate to determine federal law. That's what happened in slavery. And as you know, you should know this, that Lincoln didn't actually free the slaves. Oh yeah, what about the Emancipation Proclamation? Please do study that. He actually decided to play their game. And he said since they had declared war in the United States, that is, the states in rebellion, he used the War Powers Act of the president to seize the assets of the warring party. And he declared, you guys are saying that you own slaves as property, and now you're going to war with the United States. I am declaring ownership of your property, the slaves, and I am declaring them freed. He could do that through the War Powers Act. He did not free the slaves, and there were slaves in 4 Union states: Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Missouri. They still allowed slavery, but they did not break away. And so he was specific. He did not free those slaves. He only freed the slaves of the warring states because he knew we had to win as a union. And if the house is divided, you cannot stand. The problem with American history is that the slave issue was winning against the free issue, that is to say, free states, and free states could not enforce their own laws. Their states' rights had been denied. Abraham Lincoln fought for states' rights. You aren't taught that. Most historical revisionists say, oh no, the South was fighting for states' rights. Actually, they were fighting for the principle of slavery, yes, and their states, but for their states to expand it. And that's the problem. And that's what's happening in abortion. You need to understand it's the same issue. It's the right of the states to exercise their authority, to protect the innocent in their boundaries. And that now has been taken away. And the abortionists, you need to know, are seeking to expand that at every turn right now. It's not far away. Please understand, as the Minde tribesman said, your ancestors existed so that I might stand, you might stand in this moment.
Life Matters is a production of the California Pro-Life Council, the state affiliate of National Right to Life.